welcome to another episode of Tea and Verses. This is Philip and Maida. You will see that we're doing something a little bit different this week. We are going to start changing the format so that we appear together and it's more of a conversation. I think a lot of people will like that. And this week we are talking about racism and prejudice, not from a political perspective, because we're staying out of the politics. We're going to keep it about society and people and maybe a little bit of psychology too. But going with that topic, my first points that I would make is number one, to talk about white privilege. People have heard that a lot in the news, white privilege, which is a thing. It does exist. I've seen it in the United States. I've seen it abroad. This is not a purely American phenomenon. This is more of a hangover from colonialism, and we'll probably mention that a little bit. The other thing I would like to talk about is equality, particularly equality under the law. Many people who talk about the Constitution, especially the people who harp on the Second Amendment, seem to forget that the part of the Constitution that guarantees everything else, all our rights and freedoms, is equality under the law. So equality is a fundamental concept, not just in the United States, but for modern society everywhere. Without equality, you cannot have democracy, for example. That won't happen. So we do need to talk about that as well. And I'm about to go on a bit of a rant and rave, so probably I should give it over to Maida and give her her moment.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. What a topic that unfortunately is very relevant today and has been relevant and will continue to be relevant for a very, very long time, if not forever. I am looking at it, living in the United States, being a naturalized citizen in the United States. I am looking at it, and I have been looking at it as an outsider looking in, but also an insider, having lived in the United States for over 20 years right now, since my time in high school. And I like to start from this very primal place within us where I think racism, prejudice, judgment comes from, that allows proliferation of new judgment, new racism to occur in places where it wasn't prevalent in the right circumstances. I studied conflict resolution, having come from Bosnia and lived in a civil war, and through breakup of Yugoslavia, I've studied it, researched it academically, and tried to explain to myself personally and to whomever was following my research, all the factors that contributed to it from an academic point of view, only to realize at the end of the day, it's all about human nature and psychology. Yes. So you don't go into it too much. That's where I'm starting, and let's just see where conversation takes us.
Absolutely, absolutely. I going back to the white privilege angle that I mentioned before. The worst examples of white privilege that I ever saw or experienced were actually in Africa. And this is why I bring in the concept of the colonial legacy, because being Hispanic American, I've noticed white privilege here, but in Africa, people just saw me as white. So I had a little bit of a different experience. And one thing you find, at least where I was in East Africa, is that if you are white, somehow the rules don't apply to you. And in many cases, you're almost above the law.
Mm-hmm.
And in a very real, almost extreme way. So it's not just an American thing, it exists. And then I've seen it here. I know a lot of people don't recognize it, but the system here is also itself a hangover from the colonial period. And if we go back to the foundation of the country, racism really was institutionalized and still is to some extent. And that is something that as a society, if we want to grow, we need to deal with. I mean, it still amazes me that in 2020, we're talking about this. Because everybody believed that in the civil rights movement, that was the end of it. Not really, you know, because overt racism and discrimination was taken care of during the civil rights movement, but now you see that we're dealing with the underground version of that, the underlying things that you don't see regularly, but that are there. And I think we have to have an honest discussion about that. I think too many people are trying to pretend that it doesn't exist, but it does. And we have to be honest and clear about that. I don't know, Maida, you came from another country originally. How did you see it when you first got here?
So, growing up in Bosnia, finishing most of my high school there, we studied American history, world history, very aware of slavery, heritage of slavery,
Mm-hmm.
results of slavery, struggle to come out of it, um, very familiar with Civil War. So I had an idea about it. I also grew up with American pop culture, uh,
Yeah.
movies, um, listening to the music. Remember seeing movies that spoke about racism, slavery, set in time periods when slavery was completely normal or normalized, uh,
Right.
like Gone with the Wind, for example.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I mean, we can go on and on just talking about that. As a little girl, I loved, the pretty dresses, the hats, things like that. I wasn't really thinking about all the messages the movie may have been sending about
Right.
what seemed normal, and there's a big discussion about that. Um, but I grew up never seeing a black person, an African person in real life. Me
Okay.
seeing somebody with different skin color was only through movies, through pop culture. First time I saw a black man was during the war in Bosnia. We had UN peacekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
I remember walking on the street with my friends, and on the other side of the street, there was a uniformed black man passed by, and it was like seeing a celebrity. It was very
Okay.
exciting. I mean, it's just kind of, it's a little bit absurd, but that's the perception.
Mm-hmm.
Perception is everything. Our conditioning, where we come from, that's everything. So that was my innocent young perception. Oh my God, look at him. It's like you want to go run and take a picture with somebody like that because you
Right.
just don't have the experience. um but I experience, as a Bosnian Muslim woman person, experienced my own share of prejudice, conflict, but
Mm-hmm.
not something that I grew up with. I lived in a society, community, went to school with people who were Christian, it really didn't matter. You know, you kind of grew up with this knowing that there's some people that practice different religion, but we lived together. You know, my godparents were Serbian, who were Christian Orthodox, so we coexisted really well. That's my experience. I'm not talking about history centuries ago and what has happened.
Right.
Every region has had their conflicts and whatnot. But then war erupted, and former neighbors, friends, um, became enemies all of a sudden, and that was very perplexing to a lot of us.
Yeah, it's sort of like when prejudice goes wrong.
When it goes wrong, given right circumstances. So even though I did all this academic study, tried to understand it, when I came, you know, to this country, and it just nothing answered it for me. Like, how does this happen in a society that was living really great together, you know, coexisting? So that's where I took it kind of to this, like a more like a root of things in humanity,
Right.
psychology, to try to understand it. And the answer is fear of scarcity, fear that there is not enough.
Well, it becomes a sort of survival technique.
Yeah. So it's
And
not enough. So we have to somehow find a way to feel superior in a moment where when we are really afraid of the scarcity, and to kind of get ahead and fight for resources in a
well,
way.
the other thing I've seen going along with that is in the psychology side.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, we tend to define ourselves according to who we are not.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I am not them,
Mm-hmm.
therefore I am me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the root of the problem.
It's when the
So,
otherness becomes.
right, when you define yourself according to the other, and then there is a conflict, there's scarcity, something bad happens, you kind of retreat on that.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, we still have not reached the stage in our society or in world society
Mm-hmm.
that we understand the concept of common humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't define ourselves or each other as how we are alike. We still define ourselves as who we are not.
It's interesting. I wrote a little piece on my blog about it called "Fear Not,"
Okay.
and it really comes from this place, this deep curiosity, this personal journey to um, to highlight the common denominators that we have, and
Okay. Yeah.
there's so many more of them than what makes us different. But given the right circumstances, the fear in us, the ego fear that exists within us, that we have it to survive, you know, the dangers, the real dangers that happen to us, to prepare us to fight, to, you know, fight and flight when we are attacked, you know, by a tiger or car running our way in the middle of the street, that, you know, fight or flight things, like, okay, must run. But over the course of our evolution, being conditioned in a society and the world society that we have lived over centuries and thousands of years, seems to have turned this necessary fight or flight instinct into seeing danger in everything, potential danger in everything. And now when we have the given set of circumstances, whether it's, you know, economic downturn, you know, certain industries being extinct, people losing their jobs, all kinds of things, and throughout the history, just people in power have learned how to take advantage of this instinct of fear in the right circumstances. So, so this is where those fears and our sense of being different from those others are very emboldened. And
Well, yeah, and you can't underestimate how much this is intentional by
absolutely.
by people who need to preserve power in some way, shape, or form. I mean, if you consider the concept of social Darwinism and how dangerous that idea is, even the Nazis relied on social Darwinism.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, I mean, people have taken that natural propensity and that natural fear and turned it into a weaponized system of thought. And I think, unfortunately, in the United States, that was focused on slavery and immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happened is we've never been able as a society to de-weaponize that type of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And you see it now in the news. I mean,
Absolutely.
you see it every day on the news, and you see people behaving according to these old norms that really should not apply anymore, because we're theoretically, as the human race, we're past that, but not really in another way.
Because again, this instinct, this fear that there is not enough, that there always has to be some sort of competition, even in the mildest form, and then in certain times it becomes very extreme because it becomes strongly us versus them.
Mm-hmm.
It goes from this kind of a sport. We're in society, when we watch sports, we have our favorite teams. We become so attached to this team that we are on that
Yeah.
waiting for our team to win becomes more important than what's really at stake.
Well, and that type of thinking, it's really the modern version of tribalism.
Absolutely.
Now, tribalism existed as a safety mechanism.
Mm-hmm. For right now,
Um, right, and then unfortunately, it's not valid anymore. We don't need that anymore.
some differences, cultural differences, religious differences, when you look at in a calm way, when you are not experiencing any fears or any kind of competition, and you know all of us have lived, especially in the United States, that joy of exploring different cultures, trying different foods, music, things like that. In good times, all of that is more positive, of course, um, but it's very easily exploited when,
Hmm.
um, especially by authority figures. I'm a firm believer that a lot of this comes from authority figures who often don't have solutions, are not even interested in solving any real problems that we commonly experience, regardless of our color of our skin, our religious differences, like that.
Instead of solving the problem, they say who to blame.
Exactly. That's, when we were children, if you have siblings and something crashed and mom came over to see what happened, you know,
Yeah,
often there was this instinct to point the finger to your brother or sister. I didn't do it, you know.
yeah, he did it.
It's just using this very mm, seemingly small example, but that's exactly it. That's the instinct.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's unfortunate that in this day and age, as I said before, in 2020, we're still having this conversation. You would have thought that we'd have gotten over that by now, but it's still there, and it's hard to really explain to some people how wrong it is.
Absolutely. This tendency, this need to blame, to shift blame to the other, to find somebody to blame. It kind of gives you this high, even though it's not a solution to your problems in your life. Having adequate living wage, being able to send your children to college,
Hmm.
things that are very real and everyday. Um, and they're so frustrating, and different groups find themselves more in different periods of time within society, but it's a common problem, a common issue to solve, and there are solutions to this.
Yeah,
Yet It's more about blame and holding your port, your way of thinking, your way of seeing things. Just this complete lack of willingness to try and see things differently.
Well, it's a lack of empathy, really.
Absolutely, yes.
There's no empathy, there's no compassion, and I think that's part of the problem. So to kind of round off what we're saying, I would say to the audience is, consider compassion, empathy, consider common humanity as an approach to dealing with who we perceive to be the other, even though underneath the skin, they aren't the other.
There's absolutely not. Yeah, if there's something to take away, it's absolutely what you just said. And to really not buy into fear. Every time there is an authority figure, somebody running for an office, or especially in a society like that we live in, where we're lucky that we do have a choice
Yes.
and vote. Every time anybody brings up any group, be it immigrants, people at the border, somebody different skin color, whatever it is, somebody who's in a different party,
Yeah.
following a different party. Anytime that becomes part of the message,
Mm-hmm.
it's an extreme red flag.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's
And
not buy into that. That's
absolutely. And if you think about it, I mean, unfortunately, we do have to mention politics a little bit when we talk about this. But look at the last 4 years, 2016 to 2020, has really put that issue in the forefront.
absolutely. It's just blame.
Just,
One
yeah.
huge blame. That's all we got.
I look at all the political ads, and every single politician is playing that game.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very frustrating for me because that's not how it should be.
Politics might be a necessary evil. It's the government we're talking about. It's the leadership of
Hmm.
the government that we're choosing. It is what it is. This is our conversation is not about any particular party. It doesn't matter. We have had different parties in power.
Hmm.
The current one that's leaving the White House, that particular party, we didn't really see this before.
Yeah.
It's not really about blaming the party. It's really what it has. Any party, any group, any country, any. I've seen this in Bosnia. Like I said, we coexisted just fine. We married each other. People had children together, even though they were from quote unquote different ethnic group.
Yeah.
Very silly thing. But yeah, lived just fine. And suddenly, such an aggression is brought in the midst of people.
And I think that's a leadership question. Sorry.
That's okay. No, it's like a lot of times when I talk to my community in Bosnia or
Mhm.
community here that's Bosnian, there's still a lot of open wounds, right? For what happened, and they're fully aware who was the attacker in their
Right.
situation, who caused these wounds. So there's still a lot of blame that's very natural. People have lost their
Right.
loved ones. People survived concentration camps, so you can't blame people for wanting to blame in their situation just because they know exactly. But at some point, we have to look into forgiveness and healing and understanding that that kind of aggression wasn't natural. It was to pull people apart, to create the other.
Well, it was a very cynical plan.
Very cynical plan, and it's not the truth. It's not how people want to live. But when people are scared enough, you can manipulate them to
It,
support you.
absolutely. And that's one of the reasons when you look at conflict resolution and post-conflict development, I love the example of South Africa with Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, Desmond Tutu's idea. The way they dealt with it, I think, was really incredible, of
Absolutely.
saying You know, we have to forgive each other. This happened. It was bad.
It's that.
But you have a choice. You can either forgive each other and move on
Hmm.
or keep fighting the same old fight.
Yes, and that's an example we all should follow, coming from
Hmm.
whether it's in our individual lives, the conflict that we have with other individuals in our lives, whether it's in our community, society, in our country, or in the world. And let's not fool ourselves. Again, there is this, instinct that we have to blame and to, like, our first response might be to
Hmm.
do that. But I think the key is being aware of it and learning how to come back from that response and really
Yes.
interesting in the truth. Like, we all want to move forward. We all want our children to have better lives.
Yeah, everybody wants to live.
And no matter how much we feel that we were wronged and
Mhm.
something horrible, seemingly unforgivable happened, us forgiving, it's not condoning
Mhm.
terrible acts of violence and aggression and unfair treatment. It's just understanding that the only way to move forward and heal so we can have better world for our loved ones, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, and then that goes back to the discussion of empathy and compassion. And we're kind of running out of time here. So I'm,
Topic.
yeah, so I'm going to at least round it off a little bit and kind of focus on takeaways. I think the biggest takeaway is empathy and compassion. That's what we need. I don't think looking at each other as the other is the answer. There is a common humanity we need to look at. And what I would say moving forward to the audience is have this discussion at home.
Mhm.
Have this discussion on our Facebook page, on our YouTube page, email us, t.and.verses@gmail.com. I mean, let's keep the conversation going. We only have so much time on the show to talk about it, but the conversation doesn't stop here.
Exactly.
So, at least from our perspective, that's our 2 cents for this week.
So much, Philip. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you got something good out of it. We love you guys. Have a good week. Bye bye.